My family demanded I pay them back for raising me. So I did the math. Then I showed them the receipt. There is a particular kind of family meeting that gets called under the pretense of love. You know the kind. Somebody texts the group chat on a Sunday morning, always a Sunday, always morning, when you're relaxed and your guard is down, and says something like, "We need to get together and talk. There are some things that need to be discussed as a family." And you, if you grew up in the kind of household I grew up in, feel your stomach drop before you've even put your phone down. Because you already know, even before you've showered and gotten in the car, that this meeting is not going to be about love. It's going to be about money. It's always eventually about money. And you're going to be the one sitting across the table from people who share your blood while they explain, in very reasonable sounding tones, exactly why you owe them something. I've had that meeting many times in my 34 years. But the one I'm about to tell you about was the last one. Because this time I came prepared. This time I brought receipts. And I mean that literally. Let me tell you about the family first, because you need to understand the architecture of it before the story makes sense. My mother is the youngest of 3 sisters and grew up in a household that treated money as a moral currency. Something you earned through sacrifice and suffering. Something that proved your worth and your love simultaneously. When she married my father, she brought that framework with her, and he, who had his own complicated relationship with obligation and guilt, reinforced it. Together they built a household with a very specific operating principle. Everything that was given to you was an investment, and investments expect returns. I am the oldest of 4 children. I have 2 brothers, Marcus, who is 31, and Devin, who is 28, and a sister, Renee, who is 25. We grew up in a house that was not poor. I want to be clear about that because I have known real poverty and I am not going to claim something that isn't true. We were working class, tending toward lower middle when my father's hours were good, and things were tight in the way that many families know, the kind of tight where you don't go without food but you do notice the anxiety around money, the arguments that happened in the kitchen after we were supposed to be in bed, the particular atmosphere of a household where there is never quite enough and that fact is everyone's problem all the time. What I can tell you is that from a very young age, I understood that my presence in the family had a price tag on it. Not in an explicit way, not at first. In the small ways that accumulate. The reminder when I asked for something that it cost money. The observation, repeated often enough to become background noise, that children were expensive and that we should be grateful. The comment when I achieved something, that it wouldn't have been possible without the sacrifices being made on my behalf. These were not unusual things to hear. Many parents say versions of them. But in my house they weren't rhetorical. They were foundational. They were building toward something. The first time money was directly extracted from me, I was 11 years old. I had been saving birthday money and odd job money in a jar in my room for almost 2 years. I counted it several times. I had $47 and some change, which felt like a significant fortune to an 11-year-old who was saving toward a particular video game system. One evening my mother came into my room, sat on the edge of my bed, and explained that things were tight this month, that a bill had come that they hadn't expected, and that she needed to borrow what I had in the jar. She said borrow. She used that word specifically. She said she would pay me back as soon as things leveled out. She never paid me back. I know what you're thinking. Lots of parents borrow from their kids in a pinch and mean to pay it back and life gets complicated and it never happens. I know. But this is where I need you to understand something about who I am and why this story ends the way it does. Even at 11 years old, I wrote it down. Not out of malice. Not because I was plotting something. I wrote it down because writing things down was how I processed the world. I had a composition notebook that I used like a journal, and I wrote, Mom took $47 from my jar. She said she would pay it back. I kept writing things down. For the next 23 years. I left home at 18 on a partial academic scholarship to a state university 4 hours away. Getting out was the most important thing I had ever done, and I did it with the kind of focused desperation that only people who have needed to escape something truly understand. I studied business and accounting, which my family thought was boring and practical, and which I chose precisely because I wanted, more than almost anything, to understand money in a way that no one could use against me again. I worked through college, retail, then a campus office job, then an internship that turned into a part-time position at a small accounting firm. I graduated with my degree, a modest amount of student loan debt, and a job offer from a mid-size firm in the city. I took it. I built carefully. I lived below my means for several years, saved aggressively, made smart decisions about what I spent and what I kept. And by the time I was 31, I owned a small but solid condo and had a career that had begun to attract genuinely good opportunities. My family knew I was doing well. Families always know. And families that have the particular orientation toward money that mine did, where every dollar given was an investment and every success in the family belonged, in some spiritual sense, to everyone, have a way of treating your success as a shared resource that you haven't properly allocated yet. The request started small. My mother needed help with an unexpected car repair. I helped. My father had a medical bill that insurance hadn't covered. I helped. Marcus needed first and last month's rent when he moved cities for a job. I helped. Devin needed money for a certification course. I helped. Renee needed her phone bill covered for 3 months when she was between jobs. I helped. I helped all of it because they were my family and I had the means and because I genuinely wanted good things for all of them. But here is where it gets complicated, and here is where I need you to stay with me. The helping was never acknowledged as helping. It was acknowledged, when it was acknowledged at all, as doing my part. As contributing to the family the way family members are supposed to contribute. It was framed gently and consistently as the natural expression of the fact that I had been raised and cared for and given opportunities, and that now it was appropriate for that investment to generate some returns. My father actually used that word once. Investment. He said, "We invested in you. We're not saying we want it all back. We're just saying family takes care of family." I remember nodding and not saying the 47 things I could have said. I also still wrote everything down. The Sunday morning text came in April. I was 34 years old. I had just 2 months prior put a down payment on a house. A real house, 3 bedrooms, a yard, in a neighborhood I'd been watching for 2 years, waiting for the right place at the right price. I had not told my family about it yet, because I knew, with the kind of bone-deep certainty that comes from decades of pattern recognition, that information about my financial progress would be immediately metabolized into a discussion about what I owed. I was right. Someone, I still don't know who, found out about the house. My guess is Marcus, who knew someone and who had a long and not always flattering history of sharing my information with the family without my permission. Whatever the source, by Saturday night I had a text from my mother saying we needed to get together and talk. By Sunday morning, the group chat was activated. I drove the 2 hours to my parents' house on a Sunday afternoon in April, and I want to tell you I was nervous, but that's not exactly right. I was something that lives just past nervous, something more like cold and very awake. Because this time, unlike every time before, I had prepared. For the first time in 23 years of writing things down, I had done something with what I'd written. I had compiled it. I had organized it. I had, in the 2 weeks since my mother's text, done what I do professionally. I had built a document. I had it printed and bound at a copy shop. 11 pages. I put it in a manila folder and I put the folder in my bag and I drove to my parents' house on a Sunday in April and I rang the doorbell like a normal person coming to a normal family gathering. Everyone was there. My parents. Marcus, who was living 20 minutes away from them now and came to these things out of some combination of loyalty and the particular pleasure some people take in watching conflict from the safe side of it. Devin, who had driven up from 2 states south, which told me this had been planned in advance and that the topic was serious enough to warrant travel. Renee, who is the youngest and who I love most fiercely because I watched her grow up in the same house I grew up in and I know what that cost her. My mother had made food. There was always food at these things. I think the food was meant to soften the atmosphere, to remind us that this was a family gathering and not a proceeding, that we were people who loved each other and happened to also have some things to work through. 8. I talked about the drive. I asked Devin about his kids. I was entirely normal, which I think confused some people who expected me to come in already defensive. After an hour or so, my father cleared his throat in the way that meant we were transitioning from the social portion of the evening to the business portion. He said he was glad everyone could get together. He said these kinds of conversations were important. He said that in families, sometimes things needed to be addressed openly and with honesty, and that he hoped we could all approach this with maturity and love. My mother said she was very happy for me. She said she'd heard about the house and that it sounded wonderful. She said she wanted me to know they weren't trying to make me feel bad about my success because they were proud of me, they really were. And then she segued, as I had known she would, with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this, into a conversation about family and sacrifice and how much had gone into raising 4 children, and how now that some of us were established and stable, it felt like the right time to talk about how we were going to give back to the family that had given so much to us. My father put a number on the table. I won't tell you exactly what it was, because it doesn't matter in absolute terms. It only matters in what it represented. It was framed as a monthly contribution. From me, specifically, to help with their retirement and to contribute to what he called the Family Foundation, which was a phrase he had clearly been practicing because I had never heard it before in my life. He said he wasn't asking for everything, he was just asking me to finally give back proportionally to what had been put in. Marcus nodded along. Devin looked at the table. Renee looked at me. There was a silence. My father asked if I had anything to say. I said yes, actually I did. I reached into my bag. I put the manila folder on the table. I said I had spent some time preparing for this conversation and I wanted to make sure we were all working from the same information. I slid the folder to my father. He opened it. The first page was a cover page. It said, simply, a full financial accounting of the obligations and exchanges between my name and the family 1990 to 2024. The second page was a brief explanatory note, written in the same tone I use for professional documents, which stated that in response to the family's request to discuss financial contributions and obligations, I had prepared a comprehensive accounting of all relevant exchanges. Money given, money taken, labor provided, and commitments made and honored or not honored. I noted that this document was not prepared in anger, but in the interest of having the conversation with complete information rather than selective memory. Then came the ledger. 23 years of notes, organized chronologically, formatted into a clean 2-column accounting. On the left, what had been provided to me. On the right, what had been taken from me, contributed by me or promised and not delivered. The $47 from the jar when I was 11. The $80 taken from my account at 13 when I'd started a small lawn mowing operation for neighbors, with the explanation that I needed to contribute to household expenses. The summer I was 15 when I worked full-time at a grocery store and handed over a significant portion of every paycheck for the family. An arrangement that was never framed as optional and which totaled, over that summer, approximately $3,000 in 1990s dollars. The college tuition I'd been told they were contributing to, which turned out to be a $500 deposit paid once and never again, while I funded the rest through scholarships, work, and loans. The time I came home for Thanksgiving at 22 and left having transferred money to my mother for a bill that I was told was urgent and that, I later found out, was not. I had records. I had dates. I had, in some cases, text messages and email confirmations printed and included as appendices. I had, in all cases, the notes I had kept since I was 11 years old in a series of composition notebooks that I still had, stored in a box in my closet, because I had always somehow known they would matter someday. On the right column, the total was substantial. The right column was the things they had actually provided, food and shelter until 18, which I had calculated at fair market value for a shared room in our region during those years. School supplies. A used car at 17 that I paid insurance on from my own earnings. The occasional birthday present. A modest contribution to my first month's rent at 22. On the left column, what I had given and what had been taken, the number was larger. Significantly larger. The final page of the document was a summary page. It showed the two totals side by side. It showed the difference. It said, in clear and neutral language, based on this accounting, if we are treating the raising of a child as a financial transaction subject to repayment, the outstanding balance flows in the opposite direction from what has been requested. My father read it slowly. My mother read it over his shoulder. The room was very quiet. Marcus, because he is Marcus, spoke first. He said this was insane. He said I was really doing this, I was really sitting here at a family dinner with he gestured at the folder, a spreadsheet. He said he couldn't believe I'd kept all this. That it was weird and obsessive and that it proved I'd never actually trusted the family and had always been building a case against them. I said calmly that I hadn't built a case. I'd kept records in the same way that I kept records of everything important in my life, and that if the family wanted to have a conversation about financial obligation, I thought it was fair that the conversation be complete. Devin said nothing. Devin is the one in the family who watches things from corners and doesn't commit until he's sure which way things are going. I understand him even though it frustrates me. Renee looked at the document and then looked at me and said quietly, "The lawn mowing money. I didn't know they took that." I said I know she didn't. She was 8. My mother's reaction was the one that stayed with me longest. She didn't get angry, which is what I'd expected. She went very still and very quiet, and then she said something that I have replayed many times since. Not because it was cruel, but because it was honest in a way I hadn't anticipated. She said, "I didn't think you remembered all of that. Not, it didn't happen. Not, you're wrong." She said she didn't think I remembered. I looked at her for a long moment. I said, "I remembered all of it." My father set the folder down. He took off his glasses and rubbed his face with both hands. He said he needed a minute. He got up from the table and went out the back door onto the porch. I watched him through the window standing there with his hands in his pockets, looking at the backyard. He was out there for about 10 minutes. When he came back in, he sat down and he said something I had not, in all my preparations, expected him to say. He said, "I didn't know the numbers were like that." He said it quietly and without excuses, and I understood in that moment that this was, for him, a significant concession. He had always operated under a narrative, had always genuinely believed the narrative, I think, in which the family had given and I had received, and the balance was simple. The document made the narrative complicated. And he was, underneath everything, a man who responded to documented reality in a way that he didn't always respond to words. He didn't apologize. I want to be honest about that because I think the story where everything gets resolved at the table is too clean for what actually happened. He didn't apologize, and my mother didn't apologize, and Marcus left before dinner was finished and sent me a long hostile text from the driveway about loyalty and how I'd humiliated the family. Devin hugged me before he left and said, into my ear, just barely audible, "I had a jar too." I squeezed his arm. The number my father had put on the table at the beginning of the evening was not mentioned again. What happened in the weeks and months after was not a dramatic reconciliation. I want to be clear about that because I know that's the story people want. It was something more gradual and more real than that. My mother called me 3 weeks later. She asked if we could talk, just the two of us without the others. We met for lunch halfway between our cities at a diner she suggested, and we sat across from each other in a booth and ordered coffee, and she was quiet for a long time before she started talking. She talked about her own childhood, about her own mother, who had been even harder and more transactional than she had ever been, and about how growing up in that house had built in her the deep-grooved belief that money was the primary language of love, that sacrifice demonstrated devotion, and that those sacrifices were meant to circle back. She said she thought she had been trying to express love and pride and hadn't understood until she saw the document that what she had actually been expressing was debt. She said those were not the same thing. She said she was sorry. It was not a perfect apology. It contained some elements of explanation that sailed close to excuse. But it was real, and it was the first time in my life she had said sorry to me about something serious and meant it, and I accepted it in the spirit it was offered and told her I appreciated it and that I loved her. I meant both things. My father and I had a shorter, quieter version of a similar conversation about a month later. He's not a man of many words about feelings. He said that looking back at how things had been run, he thought some of the decisions hadn't been fair to me. He said I'd been the oldest and that a lot had landed on me that shouldn't have. He said he hoped I knew that whatever the arrangements had been, they hadn't meant I wasn't valued. I said I knew. I think that was true and untrue simultaneously, and I think he knew that too, and we both let it be complicated because the alternative was a conversation neither of us were equipped for at a diner on a Tuesday. Marcus and I have not fully repaired things. He and I have a fundamental difference of perspective about what happened in that house and what it means, and I don't think the document helped with that. I think it hardened something in him that was already rigid. We are civil when we're in the same place. I don't expect more than that right now. I am not closed to more than that in the future. Devin texted me about 2 months after the meeting. He said he'd been thinking about it a lot and that he wanted to talk. We had a long phone call on a Sunday afternoon where he told me things about his experience in that house that I'd suspected but hadn't known, and I told him things about my experience that he'd suspected but hadn't known, and we were both sitting alone in our separate cities with the quiet understanding that we'd grown up in the same house and in some essential ways in different families. We talk more now than we ever have. It's one of the better things that came out of this. Renee is the one I talk to most. She was always the one I was closest to, and after the meeting she called me and we stayed on the phone for almost 3 hours. She said she'd always known that something was off about the way money moved in the family, but that seeing it laid out had given her a framework to understand things she'd been confused about for years. She also told me that she'd been asked, separately, to contribute to the family foundation, a contribution she had not yet made and now had very firm feelings about. We have become, in the year since, the kind of siblings who call each other midweek for no particular reason. That is, I think, the best thing that folder of documents ever did. Here is what I want to say to you directly, because I think this story has an audience that is specific and real. If you grew up in a household where love was denominated in debt, you know something that people who didn't grow up that way genuinely don't know. You know the way it lives in your body. The specific drop in your stomach when your phone rings and it's a family member and something about the timing feels like business. The way you've been trained to feel guilty about your own success, to keep it quiet, to share it before you've even fully grasped it, because happiness that isn't distributed has always felt in your nervous system like a target. I want to tell you that you are allowed to keep what you earned. You are allowed to have built something and to protect it. Love is not a loan. Your childhood was not an invoice. The people who raised you made a choice to bring you into the world, and that choice came with an obligation that ran toward you, not one that you now carry toward them in perpetuity. This does not mean you don't help your family. I still help my family. I helped my mother with a car repair last year. I am contributing to Devon's kids' college savings accounts in a modest way because I love those kids and I want good things for them. I am not rigid and I am not cold and I am not withholding. What I am is clear. What I am is someone who stopped letting my love for my family be used as a mechanism to extract things from me, and who started letting it be what it always should have been. Something given freely, without a ledger, without a return expectation. Something real. The document on that table was not revenge. I need you to understand that. It was the first time in my life that I walked into a room with my family and stood on even ground. It was the first time I had numbers instead of feelings, documentation instead of memory, facts instead of the version of events that had always been curated for me by the people who held the narrative. It was the first time I didn't leave that house feeling like I owed something. I drove home on a Sunday night in April with the windows down and the radio on, and I thought about 11-year-old me, writing in a composition notebook by the light from the hallway. I thought about what I would tell that kid if I could reach back through the years and sit with him for a minute in his room with the jar that was now lighter than it had been. I would tell him, keep writing it down. Keep writing all of it down. Not because you're planning something. Not because you're building a case. But because your reality is real and your memory matters, and someday you are going to need to know that you were not imagining things. Someday, in a room full of people who share your blood and who have a long history of deciding what the story is, you are going to need to stand up and say, I also know what happened. I was there too. And I kept my own records. Keep writing it down. You're going to need it. And then, one Sunday in April, you're going to use it. And it will be the last Sunday like that one. Promise.